Imagine Britain 2,000 years ago, before Christianity, before science. A world where everything seemed dangerous.
The world was full of an enormous range of different powers and spirits. They were constantly on guard against threats which apparently mere mortals can do nothing about.
In that world, magicians ruled. They alone could negotiate with nature.
Nature was stocked full of potentialities, of powers. If they could imitate nature, if they could cunningly penetrate her, and the sexual language there is very important, then they could master her powers and turn them to their own ends. This was both desirable and dangerous.
And so it remained, until the late 6th century, when Christian missionaries arrived to spread a new message. There is one God who controls everything.
The Christian doctrine of creation gave people a very firm sense that things had meaning and that there was a God who listened. A worldview which at its deepest level was anti-magical. You couldn't coerce the divine, you could simply supplicate it.
In the centuries since then, everything and nothing has changed. These people are celebrating Beltane, a pagan festival to welcome spring after the cold of winter. They aren't primitive people. They're children of a modern material world. But they want something that neither science nor Christianity can give them.
Beltane inspires a tremendous energy, and it's something separate from the real world, the consumer world, the work world that we're all involved with.
It's a pure celebration of the wonderful miracle that nature is. We're playing with fire, and that creates magic.
Battles about God and magic once drenched these islands in blood.
These people, unless they repent of their sins and believe in Jesus Christ, they will be in hell for eternity.
The battleground changes, but the issue is eternal. Is there a place for the supernatural in our lives? And if so, who should define it? Compared to our ancestors, the people of modern Britain are no longer victims of nature. Technology makes light of distance and discomfort. We get food from shops. We get pills when we're sick. We're awash with information. And yet,
we've become almost totally materialistic, saturated in materialism, 99%. But 1% will never ultimately be colonized, and that 1% is the emotional human need. It's perhaps, that is, if it could be isolated, that's the thing that perhaps makes us really human. It's just that grain of consciousness that isn't just about shopping and reproducing.
That grain of consciousness, that yearning for something supernatural, has a long history on these islands. To understand how it survives, you have to go back to the days before Christianity arrived, before science began explaining things. When people lived at the mercy of the elements and believed that nature was alive with spirits.
It's a world of cycles and seasons. The customs of the world of agriculture, are dominated by the notion of repetition. If things are planted at the right time and harvested at the right time and consumed at the right time, then one hopes things go on in the same way. But at the same time, of course, the agricultural world is a world under constant threat of famine and flood, of war and displacement. Crops will fail.
And people will die. Survival meant placating the gods of nature.
If there's one single theme to ancient pagan religion that connects the lot, it's sacrifice. The idea that you have to keep pleasing supernatural beings in order to keep them on your side, or when things go wrong, to make them go into a better mood. So religion is largely crisis management for individuals.
This is an extremely dangerous world. We live lives of, in the developed West, of fantastic comfort. And that isn't just material, of course, that's actually psychological as well. It means we stop worrying about things. These are people whose lives are constantly full of fear and danger and death. And in that world, what people really need is a panoply of beliefs which protect them.
In people's total dependence on the land, magic seemed the only way to alter the odds in their favor. Magicians were fortune teller, rainmaker, and district nurse rolled into one.
Every village, every small hamlet, every local community would have a range of folk, often women, whom one would consult in times of trouble for medical care, for ways of guarding off evil, for prediction. Who will I marry? Will I have a son? Will my crops succeed next year? How shall I care for my children? How should I fix my broken leg? How should I fix my cold?
Look at any high street today, and you can see we haven't really changed. Medical science may have come a long way, but faith still plays an important part in what we buy to be happy. Herbs, potions, special formulas, natural remedies. In medieval times, the people who dispensed this mixture of medicine and magic were called cunning folk. They packaged their skills in mystery. The more successful the remedy, the more powerful the magician's reputation became.
Most cunning folks saw maybe 9, 10, even more clients a day. They would be ushered into the consulting room, which would often be decked out in a mysterious way with various herbs hanging around, strange tomes on the desk with strange symbols in them. They would prescribe a combination of herbal remedies and magical written charms which the client had to wear on their body, usually with the injunction that it never fall or touch the ground because the power would be broken. Everything would be there to try and create an aura that this person had magical powers and the fact that they were going to implement them.
Magic simply means mastery. So there's an extremely interesting vocabulary of magic and mystery. Sometimes it means a particular skill, a particular cunning, a particular kind of ingenuity. Sometimes it means dealing with powers that are perhaps not entirely legitimate, that are hidden from us or occult.
But a new word with new magic was about to enter that vocabulary. Christianity. Brought to Britain in the late 6th century, it offered one overriding solution. Instead of a maze of conflicting spirits and deities, Christians prayed to a single, all-powerful and eternal God.
There's a very famous episode which took place in the court of the King of Northumbria. He and his nobles deciding whether or not to be Christian. And one of his councillors compared human life to a banqueting hall with the howling gales outside, but fire and warmth and light inside, and a bird flies in and flies out again into the dark. And he says, well, that's what human life is like, a brief moment in the light and the warmth, then out into the dark again. If Christianity can tell us something about what comes before and after, we should embrace it.
And so they did. In the centuries that followed, England became a profoundly Christian country.
Religion was absolutely everything. It wasn't just going to church on Sundays, it was a way of life. So you got up in the morning, people crossed themselves, people looked out the window and saw the sun come up and felt the seasons. And so the church calendar, the agricultural calendar, and also people's superstitions, their common beliefs, all merged into one and became the very lifeblood of the way that people lived in rural communities.
The parish church, that's a church within reasonable walking distance of most people, gradually appears between about the 8th and the 12th centuries. It's quite a long process. But once it's there, it's hugely important. It happens to be the only building in most communities which can take the community. So it's the mass media system. You hear all the news from the pulpit or from gossip. Until the church tries very hard to thrust them out. It's the place for plays, entertainments, anything really which requires a building which can house the whole community for any purpose.
Congregations have dwindled, and times change. But to the faithful, the man in the pulpit still holds centre stage, just as he did for medieval Christians.
The parish priest is called the parson, and that simply means the person. He is the significant guy. For a start, he will be able to write. He's the record keeper. He's the man with some sort of outside perspective. He's very likely a local person, and he's the vehicle for the main framework of meaning in people's lives. The ceremonies he performs, the words he recites, what preaching he does, what teaching he gives the children, the rites of passage he administers, are what basically structure people's universe.
They're there to produce the magic, to go through the rituals which are needed to keep the community in a state of grace with the divine.
But what the early church grasped was that people's need for magic didn't diminish. Turning bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ was the supreme conjuring trick. It may have been a new god the priests were selling, but surviving nature was still the most critical task.
The rhythm of the seasons is still honoured with very powerful seasonal festivals suited to the emotional needs of the time. New light and greenery at Christmas, the celebration of new birth, of the opening up of the world at Easter, right down to Halloween, when the dead are honoured, the time when flowers and blossom and leaves are withering. The goddesses and gods are more or less cleared away, and the Christian Trinity and saints are put in their place. As far as we can tell, people's actual relationship with religion doesn't change a jot between paganism and Christianity.
The saints were the Christian substitute for local pagan spirits. They were the channel to the Almighty. Ultimately, God alone could ease the suffering of everyday life, but there was a saint to appeal to for every problem: lost trinkets, bunions, sick cows, even infertility.
Their importance, if you like, from the dispensing end of Christianity was that they moved away a merely magical understanding of the universe and fitted the notion of immediate providence into an overarching scheme. So the saints were part of God's plan for the universe rather than simply animistic forces of nature that were blind and which you could harness if you had the right magic. You couldn't harness a saint in exactly the same way that you harnessed a water spirit. You basically had to be doing right. You had to be a friend of God.
But for less educated people, there was really little distinction. Saints were friendly spirits, and prayers a sort of spell. A perfect illustration of their role in everyday life can be found in the parish of Morbarth in Devon. In 1523, a new priest took over. He kept meticulous record of church expenditure, which shows that the local community treated their saints like honoured guests.
The most important focus of the parish's religion was the cult of images. They were really keen on statues of the saints. They were constantly buying new ones, gilding or painting the ones they had, maintaining lights and flowers in front of them.
A former vicar of Morbarth is the Reverend John Scott. Recently, he sifted through his predecessors' accounts and found extraordinary details of this devotion. A huge proportion of the parish income was spent keeping the saints happy.
Their money came from church ales, which were run by the wardens and also by the young men, also from the church sheep. And they had church bees, which provided wax and honey to be sold. And of course, just gifts.
All those transactions, they're recorded by the priest. When he records them, if any work is done around the statues, he doesn't say, for work about the statue of St. Loy or St. Anne. He says, for work about St. Anne. They're spoken about as if these things were being done to the people they represent.
There would have been lamps on the screen which were maintained by different groups of people in the parish. It would have been very colourful, possibly to our eyes a bit fussy and crude. It was the centre of their life. It was the community looking at God and God looking at the community.
But a religious revolution was about to shatter that relationship. To the growing Protestant movement in Europe, such devotion was corrupt, popish mumbo-jumbo. Hundreds of miles away in London, Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife. His cataclysmic row with the Pope gave English Protestants their chance to root out the magic. In the records of Morbath Parish, you can see the effect.
Then the Crown forbids any cult of the statues in 1538. The lights are put out, they stop buying new statues, they stop elaborating the statues. And from now on, whenever any work is done, there are still statues in the church for about another 10 years. But whenever any work is done about them, the priest simply says, for work about the images in the church. They've stopped being people and they've become furniture.
At one level, the Reformation was a political event. At another, it was a bitter war about the nature of good, evil, and the supernatural. In 1536, the Dean of Exeter was zealously carrying out the new royal injunction to destroy Catholic images. The English Reformation had begun. Simon Haynes's brutal handiwork can be seen to this day in Exeter Cathedral. For Henry VIII, the break with the Church of Rome was about politics and power. But for the Protestant reformers, it was about how to worship the true God. To them, those Catholics who rejected Protestantism were corrupt peddlers of magic and superstition, agents of the devil, whose symbols and statues had to be destroyed.
What they want to do is to really pare down religion to its essentials. And those, in many people's minds, are very, very few indeed. They are the Bible, they are prayer, and they are faith in God's providence. Of course, to some nonconformist sects, you shouldn't even have a building. It's unnecessary. And in their eyes, that the Catholic Church is a whole circus of performances and images and rituals and smells and colours and so on, all of which are seen as not just unnecessary to proper religion, but actually blasphemous, idolatrous.
The early Christian church had co-opted pagan rituals into its own rites. Now, Protestant reformers across Europe wanted to purge them from the church. Anything with supposedly magical properties was deliberately defiled.
The reformers understood very well the importance and the impact of symbolic action. If you take objects which have been surrounded with an aura of the sacred and publicly desecrate them and nothing happens, people come to think, oh, that was just a piece of wood. If you take a crucifix and piss in its mouth, which is a ritual enacted in the popular Reformation, we hear of images having their eyes gouged out. These rituals of desacralization do actually shift people's perception of things. They shock to begin with, but eventually they come to have a different attitude towards matter. The Reformation does convince people eventually that the world is actually a different sort of place from the way they'd thought about it before.
Protestantism is a great simplifying of religion. It clears away the middlemen and middlewomen. It stops you praying to the saints to get favours done for you in heaven. In future, you have to concentrate basically upon the Trinity alone. It's a much starker eyeball-to-eyeball religion of salvation.
At one level, it must have been experienced as a bit of a liberation. At another level, that process of disenchantment must have left a lot of people feeling colder. The divine becomes starker. There's just you and God.
And between you and God, no room for magic or miracles.
What matters most is a deeper and deeper suspicion of the powers of the priest. The capacity of the priest, for example, in the Mass, which is the chief miracle every Christian up till then saw every Sunday, is shut down enormously. And Protestants, certainly in England, campaigned desperately to convince their flock that in the Mass they were not literally seeing bread turn into the body of Christ or wine into his blood. There's an enormous campaign, in a certain sense, against public belief and to control and discipline public belief.
For the first time, it became an offence not to go to a Protestant church on Sundays. Attendance was a mark of loyalty to the crown. Queen Elizabeth introduced a fine of £1 a week. It forced the poor to comply, but did little to bring richer Catholics into line.
This served for well-to-do Catholics as a sort of licensing system. You could pay a bob and not go to church. Later on, as policy against the Catholics toughened up, if you were away from church for 4 weeks running, the fine leapt to £20. There was no more Mr. Nice Guy. By this time, it was quite clear that the struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism was a great struggle of civilizations, the way people talk now about the confrontation between Western capitalism and Islam.
And in this fundamentalist struggle, an old figure assumed new importance. The devil now took centre stage in public affairs. And to Protestants, Catholics were doing the devil's work.
One of the great ideological defences of the Reformation was that it was the restoration of the true church after centuries of error. And of course the Protestants had to say, well, how had God allowed these centuries of error? Why had the true church had to wait so long to appear? And of course the answer was that the devil had been given the power to corrupt the old church, turn it into an evil church, to send Antichrist into the world, and thereby sort of corrupt the original message of the gospel and of the early church. Now that meant that Catholicism was bound to become demonic in the eyes of Protestants.
In the newly reformed Christianity, people were supposed to entrust themselves only to God. The world was still a harsh place, full of danger, and people still wanted something more tangible to turn to when their livelihood was threatened. Cunning folk, the local magicians, were even more in demand.
The Reformation led to a boom period for cunning folk in the sense that their main competitors, i.e. the Catholic clergy, were no longer there. Farmers made up a very sizable portion of the clientele of cunning folk simply because of the range of misfortunes that farming entailed. And cunning folk offered such a wide range of important services that even if people looked on them with some certain ambiguity and perhaps feared them, they also knew very well that there were few other people around who could help them in times of misfortune, and particularly with witchcraft.
In the country, witchcraft had traditionally been treated as a little local difficulty, reversible by a rival spell, by better medicine, better magic. But to the new Protestant zealots, it was all the devil's work. Cunning folk were tarred with the same brush as Catholic priests, and liable to the same punishments.
Across England there were church courts which dealt with a whole range of sort of small spiritual crimes and also crimes of morality, including swearing and drunkenness and not attending the Sabbath. And amongst those they obviously dealt with cunning folk and also those who went to cunning folk.
One such cunning man, who was hauled before a kangaroo court, was John Walsh. Walsh was interrogated in Exeter in 1566. A full record of this examination was preserved and published to warn all readers of the pitfalls of dabbling with Catholic magic.
It's a very early text, and only a few years after the establishment of the Elizabethan regime. So you can see already the kind of themes that are going to govern the church's and the regime's attitude to magic and to witchcraft.
Art thou John Walsh?
I am.
And where dost thou live?
In the parish of Netherby in Dorsetshire.
What the court tries to do, and it is a church court, remember, is to turn him into a witch.
Dost thou practice physic or surgery?
And where didst thou learn such arts?
I learnt them of my master.
He's accused of having learned his trade, his magical practices, from a Catholic priest.
And are those arts natural?
They say that somebody who knows how to cure witchcraft must know how to cause it. And again, they're trying to turn him into an agent of evil instead of a guy who's actually helping people with their lives.
How dost thou know how to speak with spirits?
My master had a great book with great circles in it. In these I would set candles and a cross of virgin wax. Thus I would speak with them.
The use of wax or clay images in which you stick pins is the very traditional sort of voodoo-type magic.
Pictures made of wax may cause the party to continue sick for 2 whole years.
Once again, one finds the association in Reformation thinking between the practice of sorcery and centuries of error, centuries of the wrong religion, centuries of the false church.
And upon thy oath, hast thou at any time made any such images?
Upon my oath, no.
Walsh escaped jail, but his interrogation shows how the Protestant Church was using its political muscle, not to deny the existence of magic, but to banish it from religion.
What the Reformation does try to do, of course, is to drive a kind of wedge between something called religion and something called magic. It's still a perception, it's what people think is religion and what they think is magic.
Magic became a catch-all term of abuse for whatever you feared. Ultimately, that was the devil, God's rival, but not his equal.
Strictly speaking, the devil is not a supernatural agent. God is the only supernatural agent. What the devil does do is to bring unnatural or preternatural things by using natural methods. The devil is an agent in the natural world. He's not beyond the natural world. So if he's going to cause you some kind of illness, for example, he does it by natural means. They're going to be unusual, they're going to be rare, they're going to be difficult to deal with, difficult to heal. And in that sense, they're unnatural and preternatural.
But the devil's preternatural powers were still thought strong enough to destroy the true church. For Protestant fundamentalists, it was essential that they establish the dominance of God in the universe.
Supernatural powers are powers which are proper to God and his deputies, his angels and holy spirits. Preternatural events are events which seem to be beyond us, stuff we can't do, but we could imagine being done. So God can divide the Red Sea. The devil can't do that. God can, above all, through the priest, turn bread into the body of God. The devil can't do that. But the devil can do really smart and amazing things, especially, for example, by shining light through clouds or tricksy things with mirrors or weird machines which con people into believing that they're looking at marvels and wonders.
So much in nature was attributed to God or the devil, because so little was understood. And as the war within Christianity worsened, a new battlefront opened between religion and those who simply wanted to understand the world they lived in. Scientists of this period were called natural philosophers. They saw themselves as inquiring into the workings of a divinely created world, measurable, analyzable, but still full of spirits. And it was these spirits who were thought to hold the key to how the universe operated. Queen Elizabeth's favourite natural philosopher was a man called John Dee. His intellectual energy was typical of the Elizabethan era, even if his methods were not.
16th century England exists in a kind of intellectual meltdown between the medieval and modern worlds. And John Dee, Dr. Dee, exhibits at an extreme point the collision between these thought worlds. On the one hand, he's a top mathematician. He's a whiz kid. He's famous for his skill in numbers. At the same time, he wants it all. He wants to take a shortcut to the discovery of all the truths of the cosmos by contacting God through the angels.
And the stranger Dee's experiments became, the more his enemies suspected him of dabbling with the devil. Only the Queen's patronage protected him from religious correction.
Dee was convinced, as in a certain sense we are, that nature is not simply as it seems, that one must move behind appearances to what is literally occult, that is to say, hidden, that the function of inquiry is to reveal what is hidden in the world. And the magnet is a wonderful example of this. If you look hard at a magnet, you cannot see why it pulls on other bodies. Its capacity to act like a magnet is literally occult. It's hidden. You can cut a magnet and you still don't see what makes it magnetic. If one believes, and Dee was convinced that this was happening, that one can talk with the powers and spirits that move magnets or move the world, then you will carefully record your conversations with these powers.
But the church was suspicious. Exactly who or what were the powers Dee had discovered? Dee thought he was talking to angels.
He had a showstone, and he actually saw his angels in the showstone, and he wrote down the conversations he had with them. They would have said, his enemies, that he was in fact communicating with devils, that in fact it was magic of the demonic sort, and in fact very closely tied to witchcraft. But he would never have seen it like that. He thought that it was entirely appropriate, and indeed he had a very religious idea of what he was doing. He was fundamentally concerned with the idea of nature as something created by God.
The gossip at the time was that Dee had inspired Christopher Marlowe's popular new version of the Dr. Faustus story.
Now, what's interesting about the Faust story, you trade away your immortal soul in order to be smart and cunning, is that Faust is the single most widely seen representation of an intellectual in early modern Europe. Most people would have thought scholars were like him. You wear a gown and a cap. Your room is dark, it's rather like a laboratory. There are instruments and a fire. The devil appears fairly regularly. You're in danger of losing your soul. You know a lot of books and a lot of languages, but in the end you go to hell.
The story was prophetic. Dee died in poverty and all his manuscripts were burned. And worse was to come. The Bible's book of Revelation described an awful end to the world, and the hard men of the church said it was just about to happen. The end of the world was just a step away, according to Protestants in 17th century England. For them, Catholics were on the devil's side and had to be destroyed.
The Reformation was conducted on the assumption that the Reformers, the Protestants, were living in the last days, the last age of the world. They were preparing the way for the end. To us, that sounds a very pessimistic thing to confront, a very sort of worrying thing to think about. But for them, it was a source of tremendous optimism. They were fulfilling God's plan. They were completing God's history of the world. They were actually acting out, they thought, the things that had been prophesied in the book of Revelation. So a great many of these issues that we're talking about, to do with magic and witchcraft, anti-Catholicism as well, the nature of the regime itself, indeed the nature of the church itself, have got to be thought of in terms of this apocalyptic language, this apocalyptic mentality.
And in this dark and febrile world, witches were treated as agents of the devil.
In the earlier Middle Ages, there's a tendency of people to think of bad magic, wishing bad luck on your neighbors or turning the milk sour, as just an uncharitable thing that somebody who has the power to do it does. From the 16th century onwards, there's a tendency to think that what's really wrong with this is it's an act of homage to the devil. So it's bad not because it's hurting your neighbor, but because you're joining the devil's army. And so magic becomes part of a great conspiracy, and therefore witches are not people you avoid offending. They're people you burn.
And it was a political issue too. What witches, demons, and Catholics had in common was that they were all enemies of the state.
In that kind of political cosmology, in that kind of ideology, spirits and demons are absolutely central, because they are the enemies against which the state and the society are fighting. And witches and magicians, perhaps too, are key figures, because they are antisocial. They're against the godly commonwealth. They're against the godly society. They're a threat to the establishment of this kind of ideal.
Trying witches was a matter of state security. The first sign of a new threat was usually a young woman apparently in torment. Was it a natural illness? Or was a witch behind it? And behind the witch, the devil?
You have these very dramatic scenes where young people, teenagers, often girls, were caught up in symptoms which were very violent, very dramatic, very theatrical, and people would be called in to give opinions.
Few doubted the existence of the devil, but there were those who were beginning to question whether he lurked inside every convulsive woman. In 1604, the village of North Morton became the focus of a trial that showed how delicately the establishment was poised between a medieval and a more modern worldview. Anne Gunter, the daughter of a wealthy landowner, started having fits. First, they looked for medical explanations.
When the doctor decided that they could not be explained this way, when the fits became too exotic, when the comas became too deep, it's at this stage, of course, that you had to leave a medical explanation behind.
A few miles away from North Morton was Oxford University, a centre not only of learning, but also of Protestant orthodoxy. It was a mark of how seriously witchcraft was taken that the Regius Professor of Medicine, no less, lent his support to the idea that a witch must be responsible for Anne's illness.
The great advantage of this is, of course, that if you believe a witch is responsible, you can do something about it. You can't take the devil to court, you can take a witch to court. So if it's a human agent, you can do something. And also Anne, again, as it's absolutely standard on these occasions, in her fits, begins to cry out the names of the people who are thought to be afflicting her.
The names Anne cried out belonged to local women. Public interest had recently been whetted by some successful prosecutions for witchcraft. North Morton and the two accused became the focus of national attention. But the trial, brought under a tough new Witchcraft Act, didn't go as the Gunters expected.
These two women come to trial under this new statute, and after a long trial, a trial lasting many hours, which is unusual in a criminal case in this period, demonstrating, I think, how judges are concerned about getting witchcraft cases right, the two women are acquitted.
That should have been an end to it. But that year, King James I made a royal visit to Oxford. In his earlier incarnation as James VI of Scotland, he'd had a reputation as a keen witch hunter. King James agreed to meet Gunter's daughter.
This is a massive mistake on the part of Brian Gunter, because James, who is that rarest of entities, a British monarch who could pass himself off as an intellectual, was anxious to demonstrate his knowledge of witchcraft through showing frauds as well as rooting out nests of witches. And he, totally unexpectedly as far as Brian Gunter is concerned, passes Anne over to that team of witchcraft experts at the top of the Church of England, headed by Richard Bancroft, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who are experienced with and concerned to expose frauds in matters of demonic possession and witchcraft.
It was a disaster for Mr. Gunter. Under this sceptical cross-examination, Anne confessed that she had faked her symptoms of possession as part of her father's feud with another family in the village.
By the time of Anne Gunter's case, the general feeling had become more suspicious about cases of possession, and this was as a result of several prominent well-publicised cases in the previous reign of Elizabeth where both Puritan propagandists and also Catholic priests had tried to use cases of possession for propaganda purposes. The whole point about possession and exorcism is that it's, again, interpreted in the context of the Reformation. If somebody is possessed and you can exorcise them, you've brought the power of your church to bear on the case, and if successful, you've demonstrated that your church is the true church.
Reason may have been leaking into the fastnesses of church and state, but the idea that the devil was still at work did not die easily. Before long it seemed that the end of the world predicted in the book of Revelation had truly arrived. Civil war erupted between Puritan parliamentarians and the royalists supporting King Charles.
What every English Protestant believes around 1630 is that the Bible is the Word of God. And what the Bible, in its newly available English translations, tells you is that it's the Christian duty to annihilate non-believers, just as the godly tribes of Israel annihilated the non-godly tribes. And the theme of the early 17th century is the last days are approaching. All the prophecies are going to be fulfilled. And what happened in ancient Israel was a picnic, it was a kindergarten, compared with the utter remaking of the world in bloodshed, fire, brimstone, and drowning that's going to occur within perhaps the next generation or two. And it's the duty of every Christian to take part in this divine war and prepare for it.
The book of Revelation speaks of the devil being let loose from his chains and God allowing him one last period of freedom in order to conduct a war with Christians, to tempt people into sin, to drag people away to hell. And then finally, of course, the devil is defeated in the ultimate combat and the world finishes.
And to the Puritan parliamentarians, the royalists supporting Charles I were on the devil's side.
It's clear that in the early stages, for example, the parliamentarians did think of the regime of Charles I as becoming an anti-Christian regime, as being tempted back to Catholicism. They feared for the survival of the church that had been created by Elizabeth. They feared for the survival of the godly commonwealth, the godly society that the reformers had been trying to create for generations.
In the apocalyptic atmosphere of civil war, one man in particular flourished. William Lilly was an astrologer and arguably the last master of medieval magic. In the years since John Dee, astronomy and a more scientific approach to the universe had become acceptable, whereas astrology was a disreputable art which challenged God's authority. But with everything in chaos, people ignored the religious purists and turned back to those who claimed to read the future.
When something apparently unpredictable happened in the sky, it was momentous. What does this mean for us in our lives? Does it portend a change of government, or perhaps even a new religion?
It's perfectly obvious there's a connection between the heavens and the earth because the tides, they do respond to the moon. And there does therefore to be a very demonstrable way in which the heavens control the earth. And so it seems obvious to make a leap from that, to decide that the constellations, the zodiac, the planets and their movements also control the earth.
Lilly brought an air of genuine science to his subject. He also had a sharp nose for the political wind.
Lilly pursued this subject of astrology seriously and studied it, and went back into old texts and eventually started to write his own book on the subject, which became the first serious English textbook of astrology, which he called Christian Astrology, in order to show that you, as it were, could be a good Christian and a good astrologer. And he started to number among his clients members of the gentry and the aristocracy, so he had an extraordinary range.
The worse war got on Earth, the more people trusted in the stars. Lilly's first almanac sold out in a week.
Almanacs were very influential. They were, for most people, the chief single source of information on what had happened, what was happening at the moment, and what was likely to happen in the future.
The parliamentarian soldiers went into battle at the time holding copies of Lilly's almanac, which had predicted victory for them. One person at the time said Lilly was worth at least a couple of regiments on the parliamentarian side.
And if the devil was marching with the royalists, Lilly was lined up safely on the side of the angels.
His political sympathies were with the parliamentarians, that's clear. He persistently forecast astrologically that Charles I would come to a bad end if he didn't change his ways, if he continued to resist the parliamentarian cause, instead of arriving at some sort of peaceful accommodation with it.
By 1649, Lilly's prediction had come true. Charles I was publicly beheaded in Whitehall. However, in little more than a decade, the monarchy was back. But even so, the medieval worldview had lost its stranglehold on public life. A new way of thinking about God was emerging that would replace, not forever, but for a while, the rage of fundamentalism which had disfigured Europe.
What happened in 16th century Europe is that the human race went for a particular project that turned out to fail, and the project was to go for bust, to try and bring about the rule of God and his saints in this earth as soon as possible, by destroying all the enemies of God, fighting the Turk, annihilating Catholics or Protestants, depending on which side you were, destroying your local witches and bad magicians, in other words, cleaning up your neighborhood so completely it would be perfect, and then watching out for the signs that God will give to you to tell you how to finish the job. What was becoming obvious by the late 17th century is this was wrong.
The Age of Enlightenment was beginning. In the next 2 centuries, the destructiveness of religious certainty would be replaced by a new emphasis on human happiness and tolerance.
What they're moving to is a new idea that God is gentler than had been thought, and more remote than had been thought. And what he's created is not a battlefield or a football pitch between warring angelic and demonic factions, but a mechanism. In other words, a machine operating according to rules of nature. And the way forward is not for human beings to try and destroy the wrong sort of life, but to try and learn how the machine works for themselves, and that way to achieve God's purpose. And once you decide that, you have to have a new science to cope with the challenge.
The new science was driven by the light of reason, but beyond its beam, the yearning for the supernatural lived on.